I was accused of my son. The shocking truth destroyed my ex-husband's life instead, and then. It was one of those quiet, burnt orange autumn afternoons in Cincinnati where the light slipped lazily through the kitchen window like honey, warming everything it touched, but doing nothing to ease the weight I carried on my shoulders. I was slicing vegetables for dinner, half distracted, while my son Leo sat at the table, pencil in hand, hunched over his sixth-grade science workbook with a furrowed brow and a lip caught between his teeth. His energy had been different lately, quieter, dimmer, like a bulb that had started flickering, and though I told myself it was probably just the seasonal change or school stress, I couldn't shake the way his skin looked thinner, his cheeks a shade paler than usual. He suddenly dropped his pencil and turned toward me, eyes lighting up in that way only an 11-year-old's can when he's about to talk about something exciting. Dad said he's taking me to the zoo this weekend. Will you come too? He asked, hopeful, not understanding how that single sentence made my heart clench in ways I couldn't explain. I set the knife down and leaned on the counter, watching his face closely. His excitement was genuine, that much was clear, and I couldn't bring myself to rain on it, not after everything. You two should go and enjoy it, I told him, keeping my voice soft, my smile steady. I have to work Saturday anyway. I didn't mention that Brent hadn't told me a damn thing about this zoo trip and probably decided it 5 minutes before he texted Leo to score more points in the endless popularity contest I never asked to be in. We'd been divorced for a little over 3 years now, and while I had primary custody, Brent had the money, the status, and the luxury lifestyle Leo only experienced in small, dazzling weekend doses. I worked part-time at a local dentist's office, not glamorous but stable enough. And while I wanted full-time hours, I'd cut my schedule short after the divorce to make sure I was home when Leo needed me. Brent had remarried within the first year, Laura, a nurse with a professional smile and a gaze like polished steel, but he made it clear that our son was still his priority, or so he claimed during mediation. In reality, Leo's weekends with Brent meant overpriced brunches, museum passes, random tech gadgets, and rides in his spotless Audi that Leo always described with way too much enthusiasm. And every Sunday night, my boy would come home with his arms full of things and his mouth full of stories, and I'd pretend it didn't sting, the way he glowed while recounting every detail. That night, as I tucked him into bed, he asked me something I wasn't prepared for. "Mom, are you happy being with me?" The question was like a punch straight to the chest, so sincere it broke me a little. I kissed his forehead and ran a hand over his damp curls. "Of course I am," I whispered. "I'm the happiest woman in the whole world." He smiled like that answer fixed everything, and maybe for him it did. But I lay awake long after he fell asleep, staring at the ceiling and trying to quiet the unease that had crept in again. Leo had been getting tired more easily lately, asking to lie down after school or skipping his usual backyard basketball time altogether. His appetite was shrinking too, though he never mentioned feeling sick. Maybe I wouldn't have panicked so quickly if it wasn't for the way he looked after brushing his teeth one morning, washed out, like color had been drained from his face. It hit me hard, and I knew I couldn't keep brushing it off as nothing. I called his pediatrician the next day, explained what I'd seen, what I felt, how something just didn't feel right. She booked us in for a full checkup and told me we'd run some blood tests just to be sure. I tried not to think the worst, but that was easier said than done. While we waited for the results, I was basically functioning on black coffee and adrenaline. Leo still went to school, still did his homework, still tried to play video games with his friends like nothing was wrong. But I saw it, how he'd take longer getting up from the couch, how he started skipping breakfast more often than not. I reached out to Brent and told him what was going on. He listened, sounded concerned in that calm, composed doctor way of his, and then reassured me that we'd wait for the results before making assumptions. His new wife, Laura, jumped into the conversation too, throwing around clinical terms and symptom assessments, and for a few minutes I just sat there on the phone feeling like an outsider in a conversation about my own child. I didn't have a medical degree or the vocabulary to match theirs, but I was the one who cleaned Leo's cuts, tracked his fevers, memorized his allergies, and knew when something was off just by the sound of his footsteps down the hall. When the test results came in, I took Leo to the hospital myself. Brent said he had back-to-back surgeries that day, and Laura was working a double shift. I didn't mind. I wanted to be there when the doctor told us what was going on. The waiting room felt like it was closing in on me. Leo was sitting beside me, holding my hand, his fingers colder than usual. Dr. Wyatt came in with a file folder that looked thicker than it should have been and a face that had no business looking that serious. "Can we step inside?" he asked, and every hair on my arm stood up. The moment he said the words acute lymphoblastic leukemia, my world cracked open. It was like being thrown into water and not being able to tell which way was up. I squeezed Leo's hand, held my breath, nodded at all the right times as Dr. Wyatt explained the treatment plan, the prognosis, the timelines. But none of it registered. All I saw was my son's face, too still, too calm, as he said, "It's okay, Mom. I'm strong." And he was stronger than I'd ever known. That night, I lay beside him in bed, our little apartment, so quiet it felt like the walls were holding their breath. He was already asleep, but I couldn't stop staring at the rise and fall of his chest, at the way his fingers twitched slightly in his dreams. I'd never felt fear like this before. Not when I gave birth to him. Not when Brent left. Not even when I stood alone in court trying to prove I could raise a child on my own. This was different. This was a kind of fear that settled in your bones and refused to let go. And something inside me knew this was just the beginning. The first time we walked into Midtown Children's Hospital, I felt like I'd stepped onto another planet where time bent differently and hope came with a price tag no one could see. Everything inside was bright and polished, like it was designed to distract you from the fact that no one was there for good news. Leo held my hand tightly, his face unreadable, though I could feel his fear by the way he pressed his fingers into mine. Dr. Wyatt greeted us with a smile that tried to be warm but didn't quite reach his eyes. He explained the treatment plan again, this time slower, in more detail: chemotherapy, steroids, possible transfusions, weeks of inpatient care followed by outpatient monitoring if things went well. I nodded through all of it, but I didn't feel like I was inside my body anymore. I had to quit nearly all of my work shifts, taking only what I could do remotely in the early mornings before Leo woke up or during the rare windows when he wasn't too nauseous to sit upright. I spent most nights in the hospital chair beside his bed, my back permanently aching from the awful recliner, my head spinning from the smell of antiseptic and the sound of 4 beeping. At 2 a.m. Leo never complained. Even when he vomited into a pink basin for the 3rd time that morning. Even when the nurse struggled to find a good vein for the blood draw. Even when the patches of his hair started coming out in clumps after week 2 of treatment. He never once asked why this was happening to him. The day he started crying after seeing himself in the mirror was the day I knew what I had to do. I went home that night, took out the kitchen scissors, and cut my own hair down to the scalp without hesitating. The next morning when I walked into his room with a beanie over my head and pulled it off, his eyes widened with disbelief. "Now we're real twins," I said, trying to smile through it. He reached out to touch my stubbled head and whispered, "You look cooler than me." I wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. But I just told him, we're the toughest team in this whole damn hospital. Brent started showing up more often once things got serious. At first, he would breeze in for a quick hour between surgeries, dressed in scrubs, tossing a sandwich or some expensive action figure onto Leo's lap before walking back out again. But then the visits stretched longer. He'd sit with Leo while I ran home for clean clothes. Sometimes Laura came too, silent and observant, always standing near the door like she didn't want to be fully inside the room. I caught Brent speaking with Dr. Wyatt in hushed tones one afternoon, exchanging medical jargon I didn't follow. When I asked what they were discussing, Brent casually mentioned he'd reached out to colleagues in Atlanta for a possible second opinion. "I just want to explore every option," he said. "We've got the connections to do that." Something about the way he said "we" made my skin crawl. Laura wasn't Leo's mother, yet Brent spoke like she was co-captaining this sinking ship with him, while I was just some well-meaning passenger clinging to the railing. I told them I wasn't moving Leo across the country in the middle of his chemotherapy cycle. Dr. Wyatt supported that decision. "Let's see how he responds to the current protocol before considering relocation," he advised, diplomatically. Brent nodded, but I saw the look pass between him and Laura, a shared disappointment that I dared to disagree with them. Despite everything, Leo showed small improvements in early December. His blood counts began trending in the right direction. He laughed more, ate small meals without gagging, Even managed to play a few rounds of Uno with a boy from the next room. I let myself breathe again for the first time in weeks. I bought him a cheap tablet so he could watch movies in bed, and even surprised him with a little Christmas tree that we decorated with paper stars and stickers. For a moment, it felt like we'd turned a corner. Then came the relapse. One night I was helping Leo into fresh pajamas when he suddenly collapsed against my chest. I screamed for help, and within seconds nurses flooded the room, followed by Dr. Wyatt. They stabilized him quickly, but the blood work that came back 2 days later told us the truth. The cancer was no longer responding to the treatment. I stood there in the hallway, my body pressed against the wall, as Dr. Wyatt explained that our next step would be a much more aggressive protocol, with significantly higher risk and no guarantees. Brent showed up within the hour, suit jacket still wrinkled from whatever important meeting he'd left behind. He looked at me and said, "We need to be realistic now." I stared at him, unblinking, waiting for him to say something, anything, that didn't sound like surrender. But instead, he said, "Let's talk about comfort care." My hands clenched so tightly the paper coffee cup I'd been holding collapsed. "You're ready to give up on our son?" I said through clenched teeth. "Don't be dramatic, Nina," he replied, with that infuriating calm that made me want to scream. "It's about quality of life now." I turned away before I said something I couldn't take back. The days after that conversation blurred together in a haze of exhaustion and anger. Leo began sleeping more, waking only in short bursts, too weak to even hold a spoon. His voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, fragile and distant. One night, he looked up at me and whispered, "Mom, it really hurts." I told him I'd talk to the doctor, that we'd fix it, that I'd make sure he didn't suffer like that again. I wasn't prepared for how much it would take to keep that promise. I went straight to Dr. Wyatt and demanded stronger meds, anything that would make my son's pain stop. "I can't sit there and listen to him cry through the night anymore," I said, voice trembling but firm. He nodded and told me he'd increase the morphine drip, and I thanked him, not realizing there was a nurse standing just outside the curtain who would later recall that plea in a very different light. That week, Brent began arriving during off hours, showing up after 10 p.m., staying until 2 or 3 in the morning. He had no scheduled surgeries during that time. Laura told me during one elevator ride that he'd taken a leave of absence. "He's not sleeping," she said. "Neither am I." I couldn't tell whether she was accusing me or just breaking under the pressure. I noticed Brent hovering near the nurse's station more than once, accessing Leo's digital records on their terminal, which he could do legally as a physician, but still, something about it unnerved me. Leo's waking hours became fewer and farther between. He'd wake only long enough to say a word or two before slipping back under. The last real conversation we had happened late on a Sunday night. He opened his eyes and asked, "Mom, do you think I'll see Grandpa in heaven?" I swallowed a sob and whispered, "I'm sure he's waiting just for you." He smiled, the corners of his mouth twitching upward slightly. "Will you come later, too?" he asked. "Much later," I said, kissing his hand. "But I'll find you." He didn't wake up again after that. The morning Leo passed away, the hospital room was so quiet I could hear the slight hum of the overhead lights and the rustling of the trees beyond the window. I sat beside his bed, my fingers laced around his, trying to memorize the shape and warmth of his small hand. He had been unconscious for more than a day at that point, breathing shallowly, his once vibrant eyes now closed and unmoving. I had barely slept, barely eaten, and yet I didn't feel hunger or exhaustion. Only this unbearable stillness growing louder with every tick of the clock. Brent was supposed to come that morning, but he messaged late saying he was stuck in emergency surgery and might not make it until the afternoon. So it was just me and my son, sharing those last hours in near silence, broken only by the occasional nurse who entered softly to check vitals that barely moved. He opened his eyes once, out of nowhere, as though waking from a long dream. "Thank you, Mom," he whispered so faintly I had to lean in close to hear him, "for doing so many things for me." My throat closed up as I forced a smile, brushing my fingers gently through the remaining wisps of his hair. "You've given me everything I could ever ask for," I told him, trying to keep my voice from shaking. "You made me a mother." He closed his eyes again, the corner of his mouth twitching into the smallest smile. "I was the happiest son in the world," he said, and those were his last words. He passed away quietly an hour later, with my hand still wrapped around his. I don't remember much about what happened immediately after. A nurse came in and paused when she saw his still chest, then placed her hand gently on my shoulder. Someone called Dr. Wyatt, who confirmed the time of death and offered me condolences in that empty, professional tone doctors have to use when they're not allowed to feel. I stayed in that room far longer than I probably should have, just sitting with him, whispering to him, brushing his cheek, telling him it was okay now and that he didn't have to be in pain anymore. When Brent arrived at the hospital 2 hours later, he walked into a room that had already let go of life. He stood beside me for a moment, his face pale and unreadable, then turned and left without saying a word. 3 weeks passed before I started trying to rebuild anything that resembled normal. I went back to work, even if just part-time, because being home alone in that quiet apartment was like sitting inside a ghost. Leo's room remained untouched, his pillow still dented, his shoes by the door. I'd open the window each morning like I was still letting light in for him. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, I came home from work and saw 2 patrol cars parked in front of my building. My first thought was that something must have happened to a neighbor. But when I saw 2 strangers in dark suits standing at the top of the stairwell waiting for me, my stomach dropped. "Are you Nina?" the taller man asked as I approached. I nodded, my keys still clutched tightly in my hand. "Detective Keegan," he said, gesturing to his partner. "This is Detective Mira. We need to speak with you." I blinked at them, confused. "Is something wrong in the building?" I asked. They exchanged a look, and I felt a shift in the air. "You're under arrest," Detective Mira said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs like it was just another routine part of her day. "What are you talking about?" I laughed, honestly laughed, because nothing about this made any sense. "You're being charged with the murder of Leo," Keegan said flatly. I felt everything inside me collapse. "That's my son," I whispered, my voice cracking. "He died of leukemia. In a hospital. Surrounded by doctors. I didn't do anything." They began reading me my rights, but the words swam around me like water, muffled and surreal. The handcuffs clicked around my wrists, cold and tight, and I looked up to see neighbors watching from their windows, faces full of questions and judgment. I wanted to scream, to cry, to demand someone fix the mistake, but all I could do was say his name in my head over and over, "Leo, Leo, Leo." At the station, they brought me into a cold room with gray walls and a metal table, and I sat there with my hands trembling as the detectives explained what evidence they had. A postmortem blood test had detected lethal levels of a muscle relaxant not used in Leo's official treatment. They found an empty bottle in a box in my bedroom closet. I stared at them like they were describing someone else's life. "I don't know anything about that drug," I told them. "I never saw that bottle. I've never even touched medication like that in my life." They kept pushing. "You begged the doctors to stop his pain. We have recordings of you saying it. Was that your way of easing it? Just ending it altogether?" Tears streamed down my face. "I wanted him to be comfortable," I shouted. "That's what any mother would want. But I would never harm him. I wanted him with me for every minute he could have had. I didn't care how hard it got. I didn't want to let go." My voice cracked into silence as I buried my face in my hands. Mira looked at Keegan. Her expression slightly softened, but they didn't stop. "We'll hold off on more questions until your attorney gets here," Keegan finally said. I spent the night in a holding cell, too numb to cry anymore. They let me call one person, and I called a defense attorney recommended by a friend from work. Her name was Eliza, and when I met her the next day, she sat across from me with sharp eyes and a voice that didn't waste time. "They think you gave your son something to end his life," she said bluntly. "But everything they have is circumstantial. No witnesses. No confession. Just lab results and that bottle. We're going to tear that apart." Eliza started digging into Leo's medical records and noticed something strange immediately. The blood test report that confirmed the presence of the muscle relaxant was time-stamped at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, but the technician's log showed that the sample wasn't processed until 3. That meant the test result had been entered before the sample was even tested. "That doesn't happen by accident," Eliza told me. "Someone tampered with the documentation." She went to the hospital to speak with the nurses, and one of them, Talia, offered a crucial piece of information. "Right after Leo passed," she said, Dr. Wyatt ordered blood work without family consent, saying it was urgent. We all assumed it was some kind of special research request. Talia also mentioned that the results came back incredibly fast, within 24 hours, which was unusual for the specific panel that was supposedly done. Then came the part that made my stomach twist. Eliza discovered that Dr. Wyatt and Brent had gone to medical school together. Old classmates. Close colleagues. She started piecing together a theory that made my skin crawl. What if Brent had used his relationship with Wyatt to manipulate Leo's records? What if he'd planted the bottle in my apartment using the spare key he kept from before the divorce? I didn't want to believe it. Even after everything, Brent was still Leo's father. But the facts weren't lining up in any other direction. Eliza hired a private investigator who found digital traces in Brent's office computer, searches for off-the-record drugs, how to alter lab data, and how to hide medical tampering. It was worse than I imagined, and still I couldn't understand why he would do this. Why frame me for something so horrific? Why destroy my life on top of already losing our son? Then Dr. Wyatt walked into Eliza's office late one night, pale and shaking. "I can't live with this," he said, hands trembling. "I falsified the test. Brent told me what to say, what to input. He used something against me, something from years ago that could have ended my career." That was the moment everything started to unravel. All the secrets, all the betrayal, everything Brent had built to frame me. None of it would survive the truth Wyatt finally confessed. When Eliza called me to say that Dr. Wyatt had confessed, I was sitting on my apartment floor in the middle of Leo's room, surrounded by the toys he hadn't touched in weeks and the blanket he'd clung to during his final treatments. My hands were trembling so badly, I almost dropped the phone. She spoke calmly, carefully, as though afraid her words might shatter me if she said them too fast. "He admitted Brent blackmailed him," she said. "He falsified the blood test. The muscle relaxant wasn't there. The report was fabricated." I closed my eyes and leaned back against the dresser, exhaling a breath I'd been holding for what felt like my entire life. "They're arresting him today," Eliza added. "It's happening." The arrest didn't go quietly. Brent was dragged from the surgical prep room at a private hospital downtown, still in his scrubs, yelling that they were making a mistake. According to the report I read later, he resisted, cursed at the detectives, and kept screaming something about me ruining his life. "She took my son from me," he shouted, loud enough for nurses and patients to hear. "She poisoned his mind and kept him from me." They had to handcuff him in front of the entire staff. It was surreal seeing the mugshot later. This man who once stood beside me in court, pretending to care about co-parenting, now looking hollow and furious under harsh fluorescent lighting. The fallout came fast. Laura filed for divorce within 3 days of his arrest. I heard she left town entirely, returned to her family somewhere in Nevada, and refused to take his calls from jail. She gave a statement to the court saying she had no knowledge of his actions, no part in the conspiracy, and that she'd feared for her safety if she spoke out. She said Brent had become obsessed after the custody ruling, resentful of the time I got with Leo, and convinced that I'd poisoned our son against him. "He didn't just want her out of the picture," she told the court. "He wanted to destroy her." Eliza worked fast to get the charges against me dropped, and I was officially cleared within a week. But even after the legal relief, I couldn't shake the weight in my chest. I wasn't in a cell anymore, but I still felt imprisoned by the reality that someone I once loved had orchestrated something so cruel. The man I'd trusted to help raise our son had used his grief as a weapon against me, turning loss into vengeance. I wanted to scream at him, ask him why, ask how long he'd been planning this, how he could look our dying child in the face while plotting to frame the only person who stayed by Leo's side through every second of his illness. The prosecutor offered Brent a plea deal, but he refused, insisting even in court that he'd done nothing wrong. He accused me of manipulating Dr. Wyatt, claimed I pressured the staff into drugging Leo to death, and painted himself as the loving father who had been shut out of his own child's life. The judge wasn't buying it. Between Wyatt's full confession, the falsified timestamps, the planted drug bottle, the stolen medications traced back to Brent's hospital login, and the computer search history that looked like it belonged to a criminal, the evidence was overwhelming. He was found guilty of evidence tampering, perjury, illegal drug access, and conspiracy. His medical license was revoked permanently, and he was sentenced to 3 years in prison. I watched the sentencing from the gallery with Eliza beside me. I didn't cry. I didn't flinch. I sat there completely still, watching the man who tried to ruin my life be led out in chains, and the only thing I felt was the cold. There was no satisfaction, no triumph, just the same hollow ache that had taken root the moment Leo closed his eyes and never opened them again. The courtroom was full of reporters, lawyers, strangers, and not one of them knew the sound of my son's laugh or the way he used to ask me to sing that lullaby when he was scared. Brent could take everything else from me, but not those memories. Those belonged only to me. Dr. Wyatt, for his part, was given a suspended sentence due to his cooperation and the fact that he came forward voluntarily. But his career was over. His license was suspended indefinitely, and no medical board would ever reinstate him. Last I heard, he moved out of state and took a job with a company that designs diagnostic equipment. He sent me a letter a few months later, a printed page filled with apologies and regrets. I was a coward, he wrote. I let fear make me complicit in something unforgivable. I can never undo what I did, but I will never stop regretting it. I sat with the letter for a long time before finally writing back. I told him I believed he was also a victim, that I didn't forgive what he did, but I understood why he did it. Brent had used every tool at his disposal, manipulation, blackmail, intimidation, to turn people against me, and Wyatt wasn't the first person to bend under the pressure. Life after the trial was quieter but not easier. I still woke up in the middle of the night expecting to hear Leo's voice calling me from the other room. Sometimes I would forget he was gone entirely, reaching for my phone to text him about something I saw on TV before remembering that I would never hear his laugh again. The grief came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes violent, and I let it come. I stopped pretending I could be strong all the time and started going to counseling twice a week. Slowly, I started putting myself back together, not the same way. Never the same, but enough to keep going. People in the neighborhood welcomed me back with caution at first, unsure how to talk to someone who'd been accused of killing her own child and then cleared by a scandal involving her ex-husband. But over time, the looks faded. My coworkers were supportive. The nurses from Leo's ward sent me letters, small notes that said they always knew the truth, that they saw how I never left his side, how I held his hand every time he cried, how I shaved my head just to make him feel less alone. "You were the best mother that boy could have had," one of them wrote. He knew it. We all did. Eventually, I found purpose again. I started volunteering at the same children's hospital in the family support unit, speaking with other parents who were going through the unbearable. I sat in waiting rooms with strangers and held their hands while they cried. I answered questions no one else wanted to ask. I told them the truth, not the sugar-coated version, but the one that came from surviving the darkest corners of grief. When I spoke about Leo, I saw the same fear and hope in their eyes that I'd once carried in mine. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew how to sit with someone in their pain. That became enough. Then, one evening, months after the sentencing, Eliza called me again, her voice urgent. "You should check the local news," she said. I pulled up the site, and there it was. Brent had been caught communicating with a woman on the outside who'd been trying to gain custody of a child undergoing treatment at the hospital. The woman, it turned out, was a distant relative of Brent's and had forged documents to gain access to medical records. The plan had been to try and claim parental rights and remove the child from care. Brent had orchestrated it all from prison. When confronted, he admitted it was his way of making things right, but the court saw it as a clear continuation of his pattern, controlling, manipulative, and dangerous. I sat on my couch that night staring at the screen in disbelief. Even locked away, he was still trying to control people's lives, still using grief as a weapon. I turned off the TV and looked out the window. The city lights were dim, and a single star was visible above the skyline. I thought of Leo, the way he always pointed to stars, and said they were little lights from heaven. "I'm still here," I whispered into the quiet. "I'm not done yet. I'm not going anywhere." A year had passed since the trial, and I still visited Leo's grave every Sunday, rain or shine, bringing fresh white carnations and speaking to him as if he were sitting beside me, listening like he always used to do on long car rides when we'd talk about everything and nothing. The cemetery had become a place of strange comfort for me, not because I wanted to be there, but because it was the only place left where I could still feel like a mother with a purpose. I always sat on the same bench across from his marker, reading to him from his favorite comic books, telling him about the new kids in the hospital support group, or about the tiny milestones in my now quiet life. It was how I stayed grounded, how I reminded myself that love didn't stop at death, that grief didn't erase connection. I'd started working part-time at the hospital again, this time in the family liaison office, helping parents understand their children's treatments, walking them through insurance forms, or simply offering a calm voice when their world tilted without warning. It wasn't glamorous or dramatic, but it mattered to the people who came through that place terrified and overwhelmed, unsure how to keep moving forward. I never told them what I had been through unless they asked, but sometimes they already knew. One mother hugged me in the hallway one afternoon and said, "You're the reason I didn't give up last week." I stood there stunned, holding on to her like I was the one who needed saving. There was a little girl, Emily, who reminded me of Leo in the way she asked too many questions and laughed louder than anyone else on the floor, despite her tiny frame and the tubes that followed her everywhere like shadows. Her mother, Serena, was exhausted and terrified, and when she first arrived, she barely spoke above a whisper. Over time, we formed a bond built on shared pain and slow trust. One evening, when Emily was asleep, Serena asked me if I ever got used to the fear. No, I told her honestly, but I learned how to live beside it without letting it consume me. She looked at me like I'd handed her something solid in a world that had gone soft and unstable. I went home that night and found a letter in my mailbox with no return address. Inside was a photograph, grainy, clearly taken from inside a prison, showing Brent sitting alone at a metal table, head down, hands clasped. On the back, someone had written, "He's still trying to reach people. Be careful." My chest tightened as I stared at the image, realizing that even now, even after everything had unraveled, he hadn't let go of whatever twisted need drove him to destroy me. I filed the photo away in a locked drawer and didn't mention it to anyone, not because I was afraid, but because I didn't want to give him one more inch of space in my life. Later that month, I received an invitation to speak at a medical ethics conference, something small, hosted by a nonprofit focused on patient rights and caregiver support. At first, I wasn't sure I had the strength to stand in front of strangers and recount the worst chapters of my life. But then I thought of Leo, of how brave he had been every single day, and how many other mothers were walking through the same fire I had survived. I accepted the invitation and spent the next week writing down what I wanted to say. It wasn't about revenge or tragedy. It was about truth, about love, about refusing to let grief mutate into silence. When I stood at the podium, I spoke about what it means to be a parent, not just in the moments of joy and celebration, but in the days when everything falls apart and the only thing holding you together is the sound of your child's voice asking you not to leave. I talked about betrayal, about how sometimes the people closest to us are the ones who do the most damage, and about how healing is never a straight line. The room was silent when I finished, and for the first time in a long while, I felt something inside me click into place. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring out the window at the autumn sky, and I whispered to Leo like I always did when the world felt too heavy. "I did it, baby," I said. "I told your story, and I'll keep telling it until there's no one left to hear." A breeze passed through the open window, and for just a moment, I could almost hear his voice again, soft and certain. "Sing that song, Mom." I closed my eyes and began humming the lullaby he had loved, letting the melody drift into the night like a promise I intended to keep. The next morning, I returned to the hospital, where Serena met me at the elevator with red eyes and a relieved smile. "Emily's numbers improved," she said. "They think the new meds are working." I hugged her tightly, overwhelmed with a hope I hadn't felt in a long time. As I walked past the children's wing, I saw Emily in her bed, waving at me with a grin so wide it made my heart swell. In that moment, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be, not despite what I'd lost, but because of it. Grief never left me, but it no longer defined me. Brent remained behind bars, forgotten by most, his influence fading day by day. I didn't check for updates on his case anymore. I didn't need to. His power had been broken, and the fear that once ruled my nights had given way to something stronger. Not closure, exactly, but peace. The kind that comes from surviving the worst and still choosing to love. Leo had taught me that. His strength lived in the spaces between my every breath, and his memory carried me forward every time I wanted to stop. And so, I kept going, not just for him, but for every mother like me, every child like him, and every story that deserved to be heard.